as usual, I like to kind of open strong. But in this case, it's going to be the kind of thing that's probably not going to surprise anyone. So, the story of this game was a net positive. In fact, I actually didn't even think of any story negatives to give it. The gameplay was a pretty big net negative. Lore shock. For those of you who don't know what that means, the whole point of the lore shock emote is not when something is shocking, it's when something is incredibly expected. In other words, this is my shocked face. Right? Yeah, so wonderful prose, writing, very clever usage of literary concepts. So one of the things they do, I wanted to point out specifically, is they like to do this thing where they have to describe the unknowable. How do you describe the unknowable? How do you describe something weird or off or unusual? Well, one of the things you can do is you can try to evoke a specific type of emotion from your audience by talking about something unrelated to what you're talking about. Now, there's a lot of ways to do this, but one of the ways this game does this in particular is it does the imagine the smell of a color concept, or trying to describe a sight in terms of how it tastes. By crossing intake by that, by crossing, senses, there we go, sorry. Intake. By crossing senses that way, you can try to evoke a different emotional response from the actual viewer, or reader in this case, and then try to actually get a feel that's at least leaning towards what you want to get across with regards to a specific thing. Like, for example, the sun. Anyways, sorry. They do a good job with this. It is a very well-written game. But what impresses me most is not how well-written it was. I mean, yeah, there's purple prose, and there's good text, and there's interesting characters, and there's a fun story arc that I never actually got to see. We'll get to that in a minute. Some cool stuff, right? And there's tone and vibe and atmosphere, but what really surprised me, and the thing I want to talk about most... Sorry, we're talking about narrative first. Oh, this is a weird one. Because there's never going to be a game story that I liked. Before you all kill me with sticks, this story is weird. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. It's an undersea where the rules put out by the judgments don't apply because light doesn't reach down here, which makes... I look at that in my brain and I just think, okay, and I just kind of peace out because that is... You know what I'm talking about, right? It's weird. I'm never going to be into this particular type of weirdness. I never have been and I never will be. But what impressed me was how consistently weird it was. Or perhaps to state that more accurately, how consistent the weirdness itself was. Usually, when authors try to go with this particular brand of weird or wacky or unusual or, I don't know, fantastical, I don't know what else word to use here, they don't bother keeping notes, so to speak. They don't bother trying to establish rules or precedences within their setting, and they just kind of write whatever and make it whatever, and they just write it off as saying it's flavorful. It's not supposed to make sense. It's fiction. I'm sure you've heard that argument before. But instead, with this, they bothered to be very self-consistent. Which creatures did what where, how you could work with certain types of things, what you could eat, what you couldn't, how people reacted to certain stimuli. It was all surprisingly self-consistent. The note-taking and the amount of work that had to be going to make this thing as internally contiguous as it is, to have this strong of a continuity to it, had to have been a nightmare to design, especially given how many different ways, how many different quests can go. And yet, the thing is, this is exactly how you design a system like this. This is something that's come across my desk somewhat recently because of not only my own efforts to design the extant, but also, of all places, a D&D book. I'm not going to go into specifics. All you need to know is the way that it's actually a campaign, not a book. The way this campaign works is they give you tons and tons of information so you understand the setting, but they don't actually give you the module like a typical module would. There's no this dungeon, this boss, this thing. I mean, there's stats and stuff. Obviously, they give you some basics. But the point is, there's no this is the quest arc like a typical module would do. Instead, they just tell you all the stuff. And now that you know how it works and what is where and how is what, you know how to react to the player. And you see how this can apply in a non-D&D setting, like, say, designing a story or making a video game. Because I feel like that's exactly what happened here. I could be wrong. Please feel free to correct me. But it feels like the writers and developers here sat down and said, okay, this is how the world works. They established the rules. They established the concept, magic, concepts, the three deities, the judgments, all that stuff. There we go. Everything's lined up. So what happens if this happens? Plunk. Well, since you already understand how everything works, you know exactly what happens if that happens, right? It's a technique for designing internal consistency. It's basically, in economic terms, it's a lot of upfront investment for a lot of long-term gain. And it's a great way to write, in my opinion. My hat is off. I don't have a hat. Hold on. I should have done this from the beginning. My hat is off to them for the incredible job they did with this and how well they did that. I have almost nothing but praise from the narrative axis, even though this was a story I didn't enjoy. Let's talk about the gameplay. So they do some things right. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and start by saying something, and I'm curious of your thoughts, of course. I think they should have nixed the sailing and the combat entirely. Just get rid of it. Now, they could have done a couple of other things with that. Maybe make the combat more of a choose-your-own-adventure text-based kind of thing. That would have been fine. Same with the sailing. But that's exactly my point. This game should have just been a choose-your-own-adventure text game, which I'm told the browser game was. And I'm told Sunless Skies, the sequel, has substantially better gameplay design, so I don't know. I haven't played either. I'm just going off of what I've been told. But in this game, the gameplay kind of sucks. It's not fun to sail from point A to point B. In fact, it's really boring. There's not much to do unless you go diving, if you happen to own the DLC. In which case, there's a few things to do. That's kind of cool. The sound design isn't really all that interesting. The music design is barely existent. And it's just kind of there. The good aspects of the gameplay are exactly what I just mentioned. There's the choose-your-own-adventure style things and the events which you can trigger and play. The whole game plays like a board game. To explain what I mean by that, just picture this. You're sitting around the table and says, okay, so you just talk to this person and they hand you a card and you have one card of Forbidden Secret. So you put that in your deck. And as you're going to talk to this other town, you go there and it's like, hey, if you have a Forbidden Secret card, you can do this event. Oh, actually, I do have a Forbidden Secret card. So you use the Forbidden Secret card and they're like, okay, this happens. You can see how it's kind of got that board game structure to it, right? This is good, in overall. It gives you a good way to keep track of what are effectively flags. Almost every video game, especially long-term video games and RPGs, tend to use flags in exactly this manner. It's just in this way, you literally can see the flags because they're in your hand as you go through it. That being said, the actual in-game journal sucks. It is very badly sorted and very badly organized and doesn't really get across as much information as it should. This is my first major complaint about the game. Excuse me, second, because we've already talked about the combat and the sailing. And that would be the lack of information in-game. A lot of things you just mouse over, you try to figure out what they do, and your answer is flavor text. Now, that's neat and cool when it comes to a narrative thing, and completely useless when it comes to gameplay. I can tell you several things that I actually screwed up completely because nothing actually told me what the purpose of a particular item or event or card was, and I was screwed out of it so badly that there's several quests I had to completely abandon because I effectively could never actually get the items I needed in order to advance those quests, outside of relying on completely random RNG. Forgive me for the repetition, but I do it that way on purpose because there's not just randomness, there's also randomness on top of randomness, random RNG. So for example, let's say I have a 40% chance to get this thing to happen. If that thing actually happens, I then have a 20% chance to get the item I need to be able to progress the quest. The idea of having items required for quest progression is normal. Not only is that a normal thing in general, but also, again, they're just flags for all intents and purposes. The acquisition of those items sucks. It is entirely too random, in often cases random on top of random. You could just go exploring randomly, which I actually did, and ended up getting a couple of the items I needed, but I couldn't really pursue any quests. I couldn't do any agenda. All I could do was roam randomly and hope. Not great game design. There's also the fact, and this is arguably one of the biggest complaints, I mentioned the story quests. I didn't complete most of the story quests in this game because I literally couldn't. Because the story quests were all gated behind items I couldn't get. And that sucks. And you're probably saying, oh, just start over. Well, the carryover mechanic also sucks. So I know this isn't quite a roguelite, but at the same time, there is a carryover mechanic. Now, it's not the worst carryover mechanic I've ever seen. In fact, I have actually seen quite a few games that have worse carryover mechanics than this one. Progression mechanics, looping mechanics, whatever you want to call that. The thing is, I bothered to get very far into the game. Had a big, nice frigate, and everything was cool. Tons of officers, tons of stats. And I had a will, I had a mansion, and I had a will. I'm like, all right, let's do the progression. Let's see what happens. So what I got to carry over was the mansion, which is almost useless to a new player because it costs 100 echoes just to stay the night there, and that is incredibly expensive to a new player. That's 10 things of fuel at London, for a bit of perspective and context on that. And that just for a night stay, just to get rid of some terror and wounds. And I could carry over like half of one of my stats and half of one of my items. Like I could pick an officer, or I could pick a chart, or I could pick a weapon, or that's kind of it. Or I could take about half of my money carry forward. And that's it. That's it. Now, I know that if you go get certain heirlooms, you can get a small stat boost. I shouldn't say small. 25 stat boost is not insignificant, but that's it. And that's it. That's the carry forward mechanic. So that's not bad. The problem is, what you then have to do is go through the early game again. The early game sucks. So at the very beginning of the game, you start off running in the red. And for those of you who don't know what that means, in economic terms, if you spend more than you make, you're in the red. Thus, most economic principle is trying to get into the black, to the point where you are now making as much as you're spending. And then, of course, you want to keep going to the point where you make more than you spend, right? Now, this is when we really start to get into it, but give me just a moment here. So you go through the early game, and you have a little bit more knowledge, so you can beeline for certain quests. You know, you can do the salt trade, immediately try to find that and do that. That dries up after a random amount of interactions, by the way, at which point you get a choice to do it one last time, which is very lengthy and expensive, and arguably not even worth doing unless you're already ready to go for that, so it's not an early game thing to begin with. You can try to trade extremely minuscule things that give you somewhere around 3 to 5 echo profit on average. I did the math. Or you can try to trade with the surface, which, honestly, if you don't have a larger hull, which you won't at the start, is not even worth doing unless you're willing to completely screw yourself over. And here's the thing. You can trade coffee with the surface. You can trade sunlight from the surface. You can trade salt, and I think there was another thing I found. And all of these were reasonably... Oh, right. You can also go to Hunter's Keep, talk to the eldest sister, go to the salt right, and sell the thing you get from that. All of these things are decent sources of money. All of them dry up. All of them are finite. Now, I'm building up to a point here. Let's talk about survivalist-style games and, of course, roguelites. But this is mostly a survivalist-style game thing. In most survivalist-style games, which this includes, by the way, this is absolutely one of those, one of the things that you have is a very clear delineation between early, mid, and late game. Now, I've actually talked about this concept when it comes to strategy games and simulation games, both of which have a similar concept. But in a survivalist game, it's a little bit different structure, even though the result is almost the same. Early game, you're desperate, afraid, you're in the red, right? You're trying to stay above water. You might die a few times as you're figuring things out. You're just trying to survive. The whole goal is to get your baseline going so that you can be good, so that you're no longer starving or drowning or whatever it is you're doing. Depends on the game, obviously. In this game, it would be running out of fuel and supply. So that's the big thing there. So you're trying to get to the point where you're static on those supplies so you can keep going so you're good. Once you have reached that point of staticness, you know what I'm talking about, right? There's plenty of examples. In chat, we were talking about a bunch of different examples from a bunch of different games where you reach a point where it's like, okay, now I'm no longer desperately trying to exist. I am now trying to think about what's next. This is the real meat of a survival game, actually, the mid game. Just like in strategy games, mid-game is critical to survival game. Because mid-game is when you say, okay, I've successfully survived. Now I get to see what else there is. What's the content? What kind of progression is there? Where can I go with this? And a truly good survivalist game, Subnautica comes to mind immediately, gives you ideas and directions and concepts and things you can do in order to progress, to increase your tech tree, to increase your resources, to explore, to go through the story, to go through the plot, etc. So... you get the base, you start expanding, and then endgame is when you start wrapping things up, right? Sunless Seas fails at all three of these steps. So, early game. The most static you're going to get is, first of all, random. There are ways to get good random seeds at the start. For example, if you get the salt pillars right next door, you're going to be net profiting quite a bit. Especially if you get a lot of loops, which I remind you, the position is random, the loops are random. But either way, that is possible to get a good early game start, but it cuts off. And you don't really have the resources to buy things that you need to. Ships are very expensive. Actually doing proper trade routes is rather expensive. Almost all the upgrades are very expensive. Thousands of echoes for everything. Never mind actually buying the mansion, and again, the aforementioned sleeping in the mansion. So everything's expensive. Keep that in mind for later. So what I'm trying to say is there is no early game to speak of. You never leave that. Let me walk that back. The purpose of early game is to go from survival to handling it. You never get to the handling it stage in this game unless you get lucky. That's it. That's your lot. You got lucky. Congratulations. I don't consider that to be good game design myself, because even by the point which I was at, which is late game, when I finally decided to go ahead and do the air thing and see how that works out, I was still barely handling it. Like, I did not have a regular and repeatable source of income. And so just keeping the ship fueled was actually a problem. We did eventually cheat in money just so I could experience the late game and just get past that. And that's when we ran into the aforementioned problem I've already talked about. Speedwits, let's talk about the mid-game. Okay, we've handled it, now we go out and start doing stuff. Well, I cheated to start going out and doing stuff. And what did I run into constantly? Barriers. Barriers of items, barriers of skill checks. Skill checks, of course, require secrets, and while I was trying to raise my stats kind of, evenly, admittedly, because I didn't know what I would need at any given point in time, I almost invariably never had the stats I needed to make things happen, except on random dice rolls. And invariably I would run into quests and positions and events that I just couldn't do because I just didn't have an item. By this point, I started actually just actively saying, okay, I'm just going to look it up. Where do I get this? So I pulled up the wiki, terribly designed wiki, by the way. And I just started looking through it like, okay, how do I get this or this or this or this? And I found out that a lot of the items I needed, which were mandatory in order to progress, were locked behind randomness. Now, I actually already complained about that, but this is where that comes in. Especially as we get to late game. Okay, well, now I want to finish the game, right? Well, what do? Nothing, because my only option is the randomness that we already mentioned. So, you see how the game fails at all three steps, in my opinion, I should say. Obviously, you can disagree with me on this, and I'm actually curious what people think of it, because I imagine this is going to vary a little bit based on perspective. Now, you're probably saying, Lord, you just got an unlucky hand. You should have just re-rolled. Two things with that. First of all, I didn't really feel like doing the rather boring early game again. As we already mentioned, there's nothing that really mitigates that. It's another problem. But the other thing there was actually I got really lucky. Some of you who are watching know that. I mean, we didn't start cheating in the game until today, like a few hours before now, right? We were well into the game before we started cheating. We sailed north off the edge of the map, ended up all the way out at the northeast corner, and then crawled our way back at one speed and survived the trip somehow, absolutely laden with riches as a consequence of this trip. We actually had a very fortunate early game. So that doesn't really apply either. So, bad early game, bad mid game, bad late game, boring transit. I already mentioned the quest problem. I haven't really talked about the economy problem, but I think I kind of have. To explain this a little bit, it feels like the economy isn't so much badly designed as not designed. In other words, to speak, when I say the economy, I'm doing a zoomed out umbrella concept on purpose, because the whole point is what you can make where and when and how feels terribly designed. You get such tiny amounts of money from most standard interactions that it barely can keep the lights on, and everything you want to spend money on is very expensive. And the actual reliable sources of money all dry up, as I mentioned earlier. So, problems. Like, for example, let's say you try to do sunlight trading. You want to sell sunlight. Okay, I did that for a bit. It was actually working out quite well. Then I discovered that each time you go and do that, you gain a increasing stack. I was up to about 227 stacks of this, by the way. When you get over 180, it starts to get fatal. I didn't know this until I looked it up, of course, because there's no info in the game. But either way, what that leads to is you can randomly die, just straight up. You can randomly take damage and then die, or randomly take damage. You also get to the point where you can't go to the sun anymore. You literally cannot go to the sun. If you try to, you will die. You will actually suicide. Got that in there for the YouTube mandate over there. Got to get that YouTube mandated suicide in. So that's not exactly helpful. That dried up. I didn't realize that would dry up. Nothing I read when I was looking into this thing told me it would dry up. No worries. There is one way to get rid of that once, and it's to advance a quest which requires a lot of items which I could never get. If I had somehow gotten those items, I could have once gotten rid of all of that. And then I could do sunlight trading until I capped out again. And that point, that would be the actual dried up point. That's what I mean by dried up. They're all finite sources of income, except for the really small sources of income. So, badly designed economy, on top of not being able to do the quest, do the stories I wanted to do, on top of having irritating and frustrating early game, mid game, late game, on top of having boring combat. You notice I haven't actually talked about the combat because there's nothing to say. Final Fantasy IV has better combat than this game, and FF4 has, like, bare bones tactics of whom you're targeting and what you're spending resources on, and it's still better combat than this game. I'm told Sunless Skies does a lot more with the combat, so that's whatever. And then boring transit. This game was irritating, frustrating, aggravating. I hated playing this game. If not for the story, this would probably be into Lamentation territory. The fact that it has such a good story is actually irritating to me. For those of you who don't know, this is the last thing I'm going to say. For those of you not aware, I value gameplay and story pretty much equally. I always have. Lore, runner, right? That's always been the two parts of that. I know I used to go by Arshian Gaia before I realized that was a terrible idea for a brand that nobody could spell or pronounce. But the point is, the lore runner concept, the idea of what I value when it comes to video games, is I want a game that's enjoyable to play, and I want a story that's enjoyable to make me want to play it. If one is absent the other, then what I have is a situation which I'm just not getting into, or I'm actively disliking. And that's this game. I am very curious if Sunless Skies improves on all this, because I've heard nothing but good things from the gameplay axis of Sunless Skies. So we'll see, I suppose, someday. Not tomorrow. Tomorrow we're trying out A Plague Tale: Innocence, which I know almost nothing about, other than the fact that it involves rats. So that should be fun and delicious. So I'll be seeing you all next time.